I cannot tell you how many comments I've had asking, should I be going running back in the first 2 rounds? Should I be going 0 RB? Should I be taking an elite tight end early? So many questions about just overall general draft strategy this season. So I wanted to dedicate an entire video on it. I wanted to go back and look at what draft strategy won millions of dollars last year and how you can implement that for your upcoming 2022 fantasy football season. But before we get into it, go down there, drop a like in this video, subscribe to the channel, and from here on out, I'm going to be replying to the first 100 comments left on every single video. So if you want a question answered, just feel free to go down to the comment section and I will answer every single one for the first 100. But that should be it. Let's go through and let's dive into this. And how I am going to be approaching what strategies worked last year is instead of just going through and looking at last year's ADP and saying, okay, this running back was the best in the first round, draft a running back in round 1. There's a really cool tool on RotoViz where they're collecting thousands and thousands of drafts from Underdog, and then they're filtering it down for advanced rates. So if you don't know what an advanced rate is, essentially, if you drafted running back in round 1, what was your probability of making the fantasy football playoffs? What was your probability of either being the first or second team in your league? So that's what we're going to be keying in on. We are going to be looking at how drafting a certain position in an individual round affected your advanced rate and your probability of being a top 2 team in your league. So if you're looking at just a base level advanced rate, it doesn't matter what you did on average, you are going to be making the playoffs, which is top 2 in your league, 16.7% of the time. So that's the average advance rate. If you say draft a tight end in round 1, and then that advance rate goes down to 14%, obviously that was not optimal. You want that number going up from 16.7. So if we go through and we try to filter down exactly what was the best position to be drafting in round 1, there isn't exactly a clear answer. But running back in round 1 actually did improve your advance rate ever so slightly. You went from about a 16.7% to a 17% chance of making your top 2 in your league. And yes, that's a small gap, but that's not necessarily going to really get you there. That's just a step in the right direction. So what we also need to look to do is, what is our round 2 plan? Okay, we got a running back in round 1. Does taking another running back in round 2 dramatically affect our win rate? And yes, it does, ladies and gentlemen. If last year you started with a running back in the first round and running back in the second round, that advance rate went from about 16.7% up to almost 21%. That is a massive gap. That is definitely something that we need to be applying for. But we're not trying to stop at 20%, right? We are wanting to go up. We are trying to get first or second place in our 12-team league as often as possible. So what was the ideal strategy to implement after you have your first 2 running backs on your league? After you have your running back 1 slotted in, your running back 2 slotted in? Well, in the 3rd round, you actually wanted to be coming away with the wide receiver. We know that historically speaking, over the past decade, rounds 3, 4, and 5 have been made up of the dead zone running backs, of the running backs that are just being drafted there because you can project them into opportunity, but they're not necessarily elite level talents. You should never expect them to be hyper efficient. So we're beginning to see that actually once you get to round 3 and those elite level running backs are already off the board, all of a sudden wide receiver is going to be the better play here. And if you drafted a wide receiver in round 3 after your first 2 running backs, your advance rate goes up to 22%. So that is a massive delta. That is a massive difference from where it initially stood at the very beginning of this process at about 16%. But in round 4, what did we want to be doing? We already have our running back 1, our running back 2, our wide receiver 1. But here, you clearly wanted to be grabbing another receiver. If you took another wide receiver in round 4, that advance rate went up to about 25.5%. It's almost a 10% difference from what you initially have if you're just randomly clicking buttons and randomly drafting in your league based on maybe a best player available at the top of ADP. And then in round 5, you see that continued trend. Avoiding that running back dead zone was the way to go about this. If you go ahead and if you take another wide receiver in round 5, so you went round 1 running back, round 2 running back, then 3 wide receivers in a row, you're getting up to a 26, 27% win rate. So clearly the winning strategy last year was, let's go ahead and let's draft a running back round 1, a running back round 2, then 3 wide receivers in a row. So this is what a ton of fantasy football drafters are implementing this upcoming season because that's what worked last season. But what if I were to tell you that just because that worked last season, it may not necessarily work this year? Let me dive into why I think while that maybe was the optimal draft strategy back then, it may not necessarily be what you want to be doing in 2022. But before we get into that, please guys, if you have not signed up to draft with us, if you are not drafting with us every single night on the live stream, fix your life. Every single day, I'm getting in real money fantasy football drafts on Underdog Fantasy. 0 time commitment during the season, so it's the perfect platform to just add an extra draft or 2 to prepare for your 2022 league. We draft there every single night, and when you sign up to go and draft with us, maybe draft with your friends, draft in the public lobby, whatever you want to do, they will match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to $100. You'll get our 2022 rankings, our 2022 fantasy football draft guide with just a $10 deposit. So make sure you take advantage of that. But let's go through and let's look at where fantasy football drafters were taking running backs, wide receivers, etc. last year. And let's maybe come away with the explanation on why last year a start that went running back, wide receiver, wide receiver worked out so well. So what I want to do is I want to look at the ADP from Underdog Fantasy last season, and let's just identify some clear league winning players. So if we're looking at the top 12 ADP last year, you had at the running back position, Christian McCaffrey, Dalvin Cook, Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley, Cam Akers, Jonathan Taylor, and Austin Eckler. So at running back, clearly you see that there are a decent amount of bust. I mean, here with Christian McCaffrey, he only made the playoffs in about 10% of drafts. Like with CMC, obviously you drafted him. You didn't have him for the majority of the season. That sucks. With Cam Akers, he tore his Achilles right before the season starts. And I'll say, let's point out Cam Akers was a round 1 draft pick last year for everybody too afraid to draft him in round 5 this year, but that's a different story. And if we're looking at a Saquon Barkley, another perfect example, a running back that dealt with injuries that you really didn't get any production from. So you definitely have some major whiffs at the running back position. But at the same time, you have 2 players that are skewing this data set, in my opinion. You have Jonathan Taylor there at the end of round 1, as well as Austin Eckler. Those were the 2 league-winning running backs that managed to stay healthy all season last year. If you drafted Jonathan Taylor at the end of round 1, you ended up having a 43% chance of making the playoffs, a 43% chance of either getting first or second place in your 12-team league. So that maybe is skewing the data set a little bit here, especially if we acknowledge the fact that, hell, Jonathan Taylor had an ADP of 11.8. Austin Eckler had an ADP of 12. What does that tell us? That tells us that if you were a drafter that was deciding to just go running back there at the turn, if you were deciding to take Jonathan Taylor and Austin Eckler, nobody had a chance of beating you. Those were running backs that were falling to the very top end of the second round in a lot of these drafts. And if we go through and look at that second round, even if you didn't have Jonathan Taylor or Austin Eckler in that player pool, you probably still were better off going with the running back position because last year there were so many busts from the wide receiver position in the second. Guys that you had, Calvin Ridley. Obviously, Ridley wasn't productive at the beginning of the season. Then Calvin Ridley steps away from football. Deandre Hopkins. DeAndre Hopkins was injured. In the games that he played, he was like the wide receiver 31 on a points per game basis. You had DK Metcalf. Of course, here with DK Metcalf, Russell Wilson gets injured. And DK Metcalf's outside the top 24 wide receivers yet again. And here with A.J. Brown, we know A.J. Brown gets injured outside the top 24. Like, this was a horrible, horrible round to be taking wide receiver. The only guy that slips in here to being an optimal pick was actually Justin Jefferson, who is going at the 2-3 turn, a lot of times falling to the 3rd round. So if we look at this and just go back to the data telling us you needed to be drafting running back in round 2, does that necessarily mean that every year we should be taking running back in round 2? Or does that mean that last year, all the wide receivers in this round busted? Even a tight end like Darren Waller clearly got injured as well. So I think if anything, it was just a bad year at the wide receiver position in the second. And just because they didn't work out last season doesn't necessarily mean you can't draft wide receiver in the second round this year. And going over to round 3, where we know that this is where you were supposed to be taking your wide receivers. This is where you were supposed to be avoiding those running backs, grabbing your wide receiver 1. Look at these names. You had Keenan Allen. Keenan Allen, just the most consistent player you're going to find. You have CeeDee Lamb. Didn't have the elite level breakout, but was still fine. Stayed healthy the entire season. You had Terry McLaurin. Allen Robinson, both disappointing. Amari Cooper is somewhat disappointing, but he stayed healthy the entire year, so that's going to help. And then beyond that, J.K. Dobbins out for the year, so of course you didn't want to be drafting a running back round 3. Then at some other running back spots, Chris Carson misses pretty much the entire season. On average, he only gave the teams that drafted him 39 points on the season. So across the board, really the only running back that was viable in round 3 last year was going to be DeAndre Swift. And if we go ahead and we look at round 4, this is where I really want to point out how a data set like this can get completely skewed. Because in round 4, you don't necessarily have many running backs that are going through and crushing. I mean, you don't have many running backs drafted here in the first place. You have someone like Miles Sanders. You have David Montgomery. They're all right, nothing special. But what you do have is you have 2 wide receivers lighting the world on fire. You have the combination of Jamar Chase and Cooper Kupp. So you could have potentially seen a draft where someone in the first round and at the beginning of the second round decided, you know what, let's go Jonathan Taylor, Austin Eckler here at the 1-2 turn. And then once they get to the 4th round, they decide to take wide receiver. They decide to take Cooper Kupp. And then all of a sudden they have the first, second best running backs in fantasy, and obviously one of the best wide receiver fantasy seasons of all time. And then in round 5, you have a bunch of running backs that were busting. I mean, you have guys like Mike Davis, Travis Etienne, obviously Etienne going down before the season starts. Josh Jacobs, he actually had a positive advance rate, even though he missed some time, even though it wasn't a great season from Jacobs, but some really strong wide receivers in this range. So in theory, going back and looking at draft boards, we need to ask ourselves, is this the winning strategy every season? Or was this a single sample? Was this an extremely small sample size that worked out one time that this was the optimal draft philosophy? And should we be carrying this forward into this upcoming season? And in my opinion, I would say no. Because if we go through and if we look at the difference from what we had last year and what we have this season, is I would argue that the wide receivers now that you're getting in rounds 4 and 5 aren't nearly as appealing. And if anything, people are looking at the fact that those running backs in the dead zone, those running backs in rounds 3, 4, and 5 just completely failed. And that's where you got Cooper Kupp and Jamar Chase from. I think they're overreacting to that and pushing these running backs too far down draft boards. This is why on Underdog Fantasy right now, you're looking at, in my opinion, some pretty strong running back values. Like you're looking at a J.K. Dobbins in round 5, Cam Akers round 5, Breece Hall at the end of round 4. I mean, Breece Hall is someone with an elite athletic profile. Breece Hall coming into the NFL looks like he's going to be playing in a bad offense, but get every single touch. Hell, does that remind you of a Najee Harris going in round 2? So you're looking at fantastic running back profiles, getting pushed down draft boards based on what drafters had last year happen in fantasy. Like you're getting Nick Chubb in the 3rd round of drafts. You no longer have to take Nick Chubb at the end of the 1st, the beginning of the 2nd. You're getting Nick Chubb in possibly the best situation of his career there in the 3rd round. And if we go through and if we look at the wide receiver position and look at the quality of talent that you're getting, say in round 5. In round 5, you're going to be drafting someone like, Brandon Cooks, Rashad Bateman, Darnell Mooney, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Chris Godwin. I like a couple of those names, but in reality, in past years, you would never have a Rashad Bateman get drafted before J.K. Dobbins like we're seeing this season. So I hate to go through and show you the winning draft strategy from last year, and I would love to say, you know what, guys? Fantasy football is so simple. This is what worked last year. Now we can just copy and paste that same strategy over this season and act like everything's the same. But draft boards have changed. Drafters have gotten smarter. They've understood to avoid that running back dead zone in rounds 3, 4, and 5. And in reality, I think they've almost overreacted. And when everybody is chasing the strategy that worked last year, I think we should be trying to chase the new strategy that's going to work in 2022. So in my opinion, if we look at this draft board and we compare the ADP this season with the player profiles that we had last year's ADP, I actually like the idea of going wide receiver round 1 if you were going to get one of those elite level guys, looking at, in my opinion, a very flat tier where you could come away with like Joe Mixon in the 2nd round. Like imagine starting your draft off with the combination of Justin Jefferson and Joe Mixon, or Jamar Chase and Joe Mixon. That would be beautiful. And then staying flexible in those middle rounds now that these running backs have been pushed down. And because they failed last year in rounds 4 and 5, when you're having to draft someone like Mike Davis, someone with no talent at all in a very bad offense, that doesn't mean you should be avoiding a J.K. Dobbins in round 5 this season, someone in an elite level offense, and obviously, in my opinion, a great talent. But thank you so much for checking out this video. I really hope you got something from it. If you did, go down there, drop that like. And like I said, I'm going to be responding to the first 100 comments in this video. So if you have any questions, go down there, ask it in the comment section. But I appreciate y'all. I hope I get to see you with the live stream tonight. And yeah, if you want to draft with us tonight, go sign up for Underdog Fantasy. Use promo code FLOCK when you sign up. They'll match your first deposit dollar for dollar up to 100. Look at our 2022 rankings, our 2022 fantasy football draft guide. But that's all I got for you. I appreciate you, and I'll see you tonight.